Thank you, Presiding Officer. And let me pick up almost the last words that we've just heard from Donald Cameron. No oversight or scrutiny when it's a piece of secondary legislation. This is unmitigated tosh, if such a word is allowed to be used here. And let me illustrate that by the current activities of the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Bill that is looking at the deposit return scheme, which is a scheme being introduced by secondary legislation. The committee and Parliament has decided there will be an extended period of consideration and a report produced by the committee. There will be evidence. It's exactly the process that you would have in scrutiny terms it's exactly the process, Mr. Rumbles, for scrutiny that you would have for primary legislation. Now, there is a difference between secondary... You refused me 3 times, please sit down. There is a difference between primary and secondary, which I readily acknowledge, that we can only accept or reject. That's decision-making difference, not scrutiny difference. And I think members should take account of that. And I was very surprised in Adam Tompkins' opening remarks to say that Parliament could not debate secondary legislation. Someone of his experience and educational background should know better. Now, I will say that, of course, I've been involved in politics a lot longer than him. In fact, I participated in 3 parliamentary elections before he was born. And I'm now going to draw on some of that experience to look at the detail that's before us, because this is about the detail of the bill. Looking at the functions of Chief Accounting Officers, Section 9, brackets 4, I think it would be useful, Mr. Russell, the Government, if we also gave the number of ballot papers that were issued. And that is something that political parties know, but the public doesn't. So I think we might have a wee think about that. Paragraph 10(3)(d), a person providing goods or services to the accounting officer, I think we might also look at whether we should include providing services to someone who wishes to vote. In other words, if public transport failure means someone can't get to the polling station, it's of a similar character. I only think we should look at them. Looking at campaign rules at section 13, which is about the conduct of campaigning and restricting the publication of certain material. I think we need to be careful to consider what rules might apply to those who are not directly involved in a referendum and might be seeking to influence its outcome. I think of newspaper articles and newspapers. Looking at section 16, which is about the destruction, concealment, alteration of documents. Now, I relate that to Schedule 2, paragraph 38(1), where the ballot papers have to be retained for a year. But there is no such provision in relation to the materials that a campaigner might have to say how long the material should be retained. I think one of the problems with previous referendums is the campaigns fold up and disappear quite rapidly after the result is declared. And I think there is a case for saying that the materials they produce should be retained for a specified time. I don't say how long, but if it's a year for the ballot papers, I suspect that gives us an insight. I think further at 20, attendance at Electoral Commission proceedings and so on, and at section 21 and 22, there isn't a direct provision for the attendance of international observers at referendums. And I think we generally would accept that that is something that is part of good practice. Now, I'm not saying that the bill as constructed prohibits that. I think there are ways that it can be done. At 24C, person appointed by the Electoral Commission for the purposes, but that kind of conflicts with Schedule 2, 15(2), where the presiding officers also have power, and they're the people in the polling stations. I'll come back to some of the things they have, but some of them are slightly odd, I have to say. Yes, in fact, I'll come to it now. The presiding officers can decide who's admitted to a polling station without restriction, which seems a very broad thing, and you may get different decisions made in different polling stations, and I think that's unhelpful to the integrity of any vote, whether on referendum or another subject. On the casting of votes, I think a legislation of this kind might sensibly at least provide provision for future bringing forward by secondary legislation, that's a subject we could debate, of electronic voting as an additional means of voting. The bill as tabled is silent that. And then at Schedule 2, the hours of polling are between 7 and 10 p.m. I think it's time to think, for major things like this, whether polling should not take place over 3 days between Thursday, Friday and Saturday. Because I think if we make big decisions, they should be made by the maximum number of people. I think there's also an issue about ballot boxes. We should ensure that ballot boxes, there's a minimum number of votes should go in a ballot box. Because I know of a ballot box that only gets 4 votes in it. So when it's tipped out, the secrecy of the ballot is compromised. Let me conclude, Presiding Officer, as you indicate I should do. There have been local authority referendums before, Strathclyde Water, Edinburgh road charging would be examples. I think these are referenda that would have been referendums, oh dear, referenda, that would have benefited from a structure such as this, as indeed would the 1934-35 peace referendum, which was on whether the UK should stay in the League of Nations. I realise even I was not around then, although some might suggest. And finally, Presiding Officer, may I counsel my colleagues, the word referenda is not the plural of referendums, which is a 4th declension noun. Referenda means something altogether different and is a plural gerundive.